The Fake HOA Enforcers, A Tale of Deception and Justice. The sun was just climbing over the tidy rooftops of Desert Bloom Estates, a quiet townhouse community in North Scottsdale, Arizona. At 9 a.m., I was in my garage, halfway through my daily workout routine, 3 years of push-ups and deadlifts in the same converted space. Retirement had been kind to me, offering solitude and structure after 15 years as an FBI agent. My name is Jack Thompson, and at 58, I thought I'd left the chaos of law enforcement behind for good. That morning, I learned how wrong I was. The knock at my front door was sharp, authoritative, not the casual tap of a neighbor or the hurried rap of a delivery driver. Through the peephole, I saw 2 figures in what looked like police uniforms. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a badge glinting on his chest. The woman beside him was familiar, though it took a moment to place her. Then it clicked. Sarah Mitchell, my neighbor from Unit 50, who'd asked me out for coffee 6 months earlier. I'd politely declined, citing my need for solitude. Now, here she was, clipboard in hand, her hair pulled back tightly, looking like she'd stepped into a role she'd been rehearsing for months. I opened the door, my old FBI instincts kicking in. Observe, assess, stay calm. "Good morning," I said evenly. "Can I help you?" The man stepped forward, clearing his throat with a practiced air of authority. "Sir, I'm Officer Daniel Brooks with Community Standards Enforcement, and this is Standards Officer Mitchell. We're here regarding multiple violations of community standards reported at this property." I studied them closely. Daniel's uniform was convincing at first glance, but the badge looked plastic, and his utility belt lacked the weight of real gear. Sarah's professional demeanor couldn't hide the glint of satisfaction in her eyes, like she was savoring a long-planned victory. "Could you clarify which agency you represent?" I asked. I wasn't aware Desert Bloom Estates had enforcement beyond the HOA. Daniel produced a citation book that looked like it came from an office supply store, with violation notice printed in bold. "We represent the Enhanced Community Standards Authority, established under Arizona HOA Statute 47B to ensure compliance in residential developments." I suppressed a smile. 15 years in federal law enforcement told me there was no such statute. But I played along, curious to see how far this charade would go. "What specific violations are we talking about?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Sarah stepped forward, consulting her clipboard with theatrical precision. "Mr. Thompson, we've received complaints about excessive noise during quiet hours from your garage activities, unauthorized weapons storage violating safety standards, and landscaping non-compliance with aesthetic guidelines." Daniel nodded, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. His hand kept drifting toward his chest, as if searching for credentials he didn't have. "Could I see some identification and a copy of these standards?" I pressed. Daniel fumbled, pulling out a plastic ID card that looked like it belonged in a costume shop. The badge had police in the wrong font and an eagle that resembled a poorly drawn pigeon. When I asked to examine it, he tucked it away, muttering about department policy. Sarah jumped in, redirecting to the violations, but her smugness betrayed her. This wasn't about community standards, it was personal. 6 months ago, Sarah had approached me by the community pool, her oversized sunglasses failing to hide her nervous energy. "Hi, I'm Sarah from Unit 50. Want to grab coffee sometime?" she'd asked. I declined gently, explaining my preference for solitude in retirement. Her smile had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stare that lingered just long enough to unsettle me. That moment should have been my first warning. After that rejection, Sarah's behavior shifted. I'd catch her watching me from her window, her gaze intense and predatory. One afternoon, I found her photographing my patio furniture, claiming she was documenting community aesthetics. But it was her focus, sharp, unrelenting, that raised red flags. My FBI training taught me to recognize obsession, and Sarah was textbook. My suspicions were confirmed by Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a 77-year-old retired court clerk who lived in the corner unit. "Jack, that Mitchell girl's been asking odd questions about you," she told me one afternoon at the mailboxes. "Your visitors, your schedule, your job history, like she's building a case." I told her to find a hobby that doesn't involve stalking neighbors. Sarah's surveillance grew bolder. She carried a notebook, documenting residents' activities with a detail that would have impressed my old FBI supervisors. She left flyers in mailboxes about maintaining property values, and ensuring compliance. Despite our HOA being hands-off, focused only on fees and common areas. I kept every flyer, my instincts screaming that something was wrong. The morning of the visit, as Daniel and Sarah stood at my door, I realized this wasn't just about Sarah's bruised ego. Their accusations, noise, weapons, landscaping were vague, designed to intimidate rather than inform. When Sarah mentioned handling Mrs. Lopez's situation with temporary suspension of asset forfeiture, my blood ran cold. Mrs. Lopez was elderly, spoke little English, and lived alone. Threatening her home to extort fake fines wasn't just impersonation, it was predatory. "Could you provide your department's main number?" I asked, watching their reactions. Daniel's attempt at intimidation, questioning law enforcement is a serious matter, was laughable to anyone who'd worked in real law enforcement. Real officers expect verification, imposters deflect. Just then, Mr. Henry Walsh, a retired accountant from Unit 39, jogged by and stopped. "Everything okay, Jack?" he asked, eyeing Daniel and Sarah. "Are these the same people who told Mrs. Lopez she owed fines for her rose garden?" I checked. There's no record of their organization with the city or county. Daniel's face reddened, and he stepped toward Henry, trying to intimidate him. "Sir, move along. This is official business." Henry laughed, snapping photos of their poorly painted van before continuing his jog. The interaction threw Daniel and Sarah off script, and Sarah's attempt to cite me for failure to cooperate with a handwritten citation only deepened the absurdity. As they retreated to their Vanna Honda Odyssey with vinyl police lettering, I knew this was more than neighborhood drama. This was an organized scam, and my protective instincts, honed from years of hunting predators, were fully engaged. I closed the door and headed to my home office, where my secure laptop waited. If Daniel Brooks and Sarah Mitchell wanted to play fake cops, they'd picked the wrong target. I had databases, contacts, and a career's worth of experience to dismantle their operation. My first call was to Officer Mike Delgado, a Scottsdale PD contact from my FBI days. "Mike, I need you to run some names," I said. "I've got neighbors playing dress-up cop, but this feels bigger than a prank." There was a pause before Mike's voice turned serious. "Jack, you said Daniel Brooks? That guy's got a record. We've been tracking him for fraud and fake authority schemes. What's he doing in your neighborhood?" That conversation changed everything. What I thought was petty harassment was part of a larger criminal operation, and I was their latest target. The revelation from Officer Mike Delgado hit me like a jolt of adrenaline. Sitting in my home office, surrounded by the quiet hum of desert bloom estates, I felt the familiar surge of purpose that had driven me during my FBI days. Daniel Brooks wasn't just a wannabe cop with a costume, he was a known fraudster, tied to multiple scams across Phoenix. And Sarah Mitchell, my vengeful neighbor, was his accomplice. This wasn't about a rejected coffee date anymore. This was a calculated operation, and I was determined to unravel it. Sarah Mitchell's profile was just as troubling. No steady job for 18 months, a string of evictions, and harassment complaints from past neighbors. Her social media was a shrine to law enforcement fantasies, photos of police gear, posts about upholding order. Most damning, her current address matched Daniel's, right here in Desert Bloom Estates. They weren't just neighbors, they were partners in crime. I called Mike back, my mind racing. "What else do you have on Brooks? This feels like more than a two-person job." Mike's voice was grim. "Brooks is a small fish. We suspect he's working for someone bigger, possibly Vincent Russo, a guy on the FBI's radar for organized fraud. If Russo's involved, this could be a federal case. Send me everything you've got." I hung up, my instincts screaming that Desert Bloom wasn't the only target. I walked to Mrs. Evelyn Carter's unit, the retired court clerk who'd first tipped me off about Sarah's snooping. Evelyn greeted me with a sharp nod, her eyes gleaming with the same tenacity she'd brought to decades of legal work. "Jack, I've been watching those too," she said, pulling out a notebook filled with meticulous entries. Dates, times, descriptions. Evelyn's surveillance would have made my old FBI team jealous. They've been hitting residents with inspections. Mrs. Garcia in Unit 23 paid them $800 for fake landscaping fines. Mr. Lee in Unit 67 is so scared he's thinking of moving. They've got official-looking papers, business cards, the works. Her most chilling observation was their knowledge of residents' details. They knew Mrs. Garcia's on a fixed income, Mr. Lee's HOA fee disputes, even the Petersons' divorce. That's not casual gossip, Jack. They've got access to private records. Evelyn's words confirmed my worst fears. This wasn't random harassment, it was a sophisticated scheme targeting vulnerable residents with insider information. I thanked her and returned home, diving deeper into my databases. What I found was a pattern of similar scams across Arizona. Fake HOA enforcement in Tempe, phony inspections in Chandler, counterfeit citations in Gilbert. Each targeted affluent communities with elderly populations, using official-looking documents to extract fines and fees. The financial take was likely hundreds of thousands, maybe more. I called our HOA manager, Mr. Tom Bradley, but his number was disconnected. Evelyn had mentioned he'd vanished since Sarah's flyers started circulating, a red flag that suggested internal collusion. The Enhanced Community Standards Authority had no registration, no license, and no legal standing. It was pure theater, designed to intimidate residents into compliance. That evening, I called Mike again. "This is bigger than Desert Bloom," I said, sharing my findings. "I'm seeing the same playbook in at least 4 other communities. We need to coordinate with other departments, maybe bring in the feds." Mike was quiet for a moment. "Jack, I've been digging too. Brooks is tied to Vincent Russo. If Russo's running this, it's a federal case. The FBI's already looking at him for multi-state fraud." Vincent Russo. The name clicked like a puzzle piece. A mastermind like Russo would explain the operation's scope and sophistication. Daniel and Sarah were likely pawns in a larger network, and I'd just become their biggest obstacle. The next morning, Evelyn called at 7:30 a.m., her voice tense. "Jack, they're back, and they've got company." I peered out my window and saw Daniel's fake police van parked across the street, joined by a sleek sedan. A man in his mid-40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, stood beside it. His posture screamed confidence, the kind of authority that intimidates without a badge. That had to be Vincent Russo. I activated my surveillance system cameras legally installed around my property, capturing every angle with audio. If Russo wanted to escalate, I'd ensure every word was recorded for federal prosecutors. I texted Mike, "Situation developing. Might need backup soon." Then I dressed to blend in khakis, polo shirt, sneakers to appear as non-threatening as possible while they revealed their hand. The knock came at 9 a.m. sharp. Vincent Russo took the lead, with Daniel and Sarah flanking him like subordinates. He carried a leather portfolio, his smile polished but condescending. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Vincent Russo with Arizona Community Standards Consulting. I understand you've been uncooperative with our enforcement team." I kept my tone polite but skeptical. "I'm not familiar with your organization, Mr. Russo. What authority do you have to enforce standards here?" His smile tightened, but he launched into a rehearsed pitch. "We're contracted by multiple HOAs statewide to ensure compliance and protect property values. We have full legal authority to assess violations, issue citations, and coordinate with local authorities." He opened his portfolio, revealing documents, business cards, and certificates that looked convincing to the untrained eye. But I'd seen enough forgeries in my career to spot the flaws: vague language, non-specific issuing authorities, a Phoenix address with no agency ties. His ID listed him as a senior standards coordinator for a non-existent organization. "Could I get contact info for the state agency authorizing your activities?" I asked, watching his micro-expressions. Russo's patience cracked, his tone shifting to a veiled threat. "Every question you ask adds a fine, Mr. Thompson. That's how things work now." He gestured to Daniel and Sarah, who stood ready with their props. "Officer Brooks has documented violations, and Standards Officer Mitchell has prepared compliance forms. Cooperate today, or we'll escalate to legal proceedings that'll cost you dearly." The threat was clear, but Russo didn't realize he was being recorded, each word piling up federal charges. I pushed further. "You mentioned state regulations. Can you cite the specific Arizona statute giving you authority over private property?" His confidence faltered, his answer evasive. "I'm not here to provide legal education. The statutes are in our documentation, and your compliance is required regardless." It was textbook deflection. Real authorities cite laws. Criminals lean on intimidation. "I'll need to verify your standing with the Arizona Attorney General's office and Scottsdale PD," I said, pulling out my phone. The reaction was immediate. Daniel stepped back, his hand twitching toward his empty belt. Sarah's grip on her clipboard tightened, sweat beading on her brow. Russo's mask slipped, revealing cold anger. "You're making this complicated, Mr. Thompson. Continued questioning will result in violations that'll be expensive to resolve." He snapped his portfolio shut and leaned closer. "Officer Brooks will conduct a full property inspection this afternoon, with or without your cooperation. Reconsider your approach before the penalties become more than you can afford." The direct threat was exactly what I needed, clear evidence of attempted extortion. As they walked to their vehicles, I was already planning my next move. They'd underestimated me, and they were about to face the full weight of real law enforcement. That afternoon, I coordinated with Mike to set up plainclothes surveillance, positioning real officers to monitor the fake inspection. I also reached out to former FBI colleagues, securing federal monitoring for what was shaping up as an interstate crime ring. The plan was simple: let Daniel conduct his sham inspection, record every illegal act, then move in with arrests once we had airtight evidence. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across desert bloom estates as I prepared for the next act in this unfolding drama. My townhouse, once a sanctuary of retirement, was now a battlefield. Vincent Russo, Daniel Brooks, and Sarah Mitchell thought they could intimidate me with their fake authority, but they were walking into a trap I'd spent years perfecting as an FBI agent. At 58, I wasn't the type to back down from predators, especially ones preying on my neighbors. By 1 p.m., I'd finalized the setup with Officer Mike Delgado. Scottsdale PD had plainclothes officers stationed discreetly around the community, their unmarked cars blending into the parking lot. My former FBI colleague, Agent Laura Bennett, had looped in the Phoenix field office, ensuring federal resources were on standby. My surveillance system was fully operational, cameras covering every inch of my property, all legally installed, with audio to capture every incriminating word. I dressed in my retiree disguise khakis, polo, sneakers to keep them complacent while they dug their graves. At exactly 2 p.m., the knock came. Daniel Brooks led the charge, his fake uniform upgraded with extra patches and a utility belt that looked more convincing but still lacked real gear. Sarah Mitchell followed, clutching an expanded set of clipboards and forms, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. Vincent Russo brought up the rear, now in a supervisor's uniform matching Daniel's, his leather portfolio tucked under his arm. The trio exuded confidence, believing they'd cowed me into submission. "Mr. Thompson, we're here for the mandatory property inspection," Daniel announced, his voice laced with rehearsed authority. "You're required to provide access to all areas, interior spaces, garage, and storage." I stepped aside, feigning compliance. "Of course, officers. I want to cooperate fully." They didn't know every room was wired for sound and video, ready to document their crimes. As they moved through my home, I watched them work with chilling precision. Daniel photographed my furniture, electronics, and gym equipment with professional-grade cameras, while Sarah filled out property assessment forms, noting every detail. Vincent supervised, whispering instructions and pointing out my gun safe with particular interest. The inspection was a performance, designed to overwhelm and intimidate. They lingered in my garage, where my weights and treadmill sat, and spent extra time by the gun safe, a locked steel cabinet containing my legally owned firearms. Vincent finally spoke, his tone dripping with false concern. "Mr. Thompson, we've identified serious violations requiring immediate action. Your unauthorized gymnasium violates noise ordinances and lacks permits. Your firearms storage exceeds community safety standards and requires additional compliance. Most critically, your failure to cooperate with prior enforcement has triggered escalated penalties." He produced a document listing citations totaling $3,200, with payment due within 48 hours to avoid further legal action. The paperwork was impressive heavy stock, official-looking seals, but the language was vague, the issuing authority non-existent. I nodded, playing the rattled retiree, while my cameras recorded every word. Then Vincent made a fatal mistake. "Given the severity of these violations and your non-cooperation, we're securing your firearms as evidence pending safety compliance," he said, nodding to Daniel. Daniel stepped forward with an evidence seizure form, while Sarah positioned herself near the gun safe. "This is temporary, but community safety requires we document and secure all weapons per enhanced standards." My pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the thrill of the hunt. Seizing legally owned firearms wasn't just fraud, it was a federal weapons violation that could land them decades in prison. I pulled out my phone, keeping my voice calm. I need to verify this with my attorney before allowing seizure of private property. Daniel reacted instantly, grabbing my phone and shoving it down. Sir, interfering with an official investigation is a serious crime. Comply now, or face obstruction charges. His hand on my phone was an assault on a federal agenda line he'd never uncross. Vincent, sensing the situation spiraling, doubled down. Mr. Thompson, you're under arrest for failure to comply with community standards enforcement. Officer Brooks, place this man in custody. Daniel produced real handcuffs, approaching me with a smirk. Sarah snapped photos, documenting their arrest for their records. I stood still, offering no resistance, as Daniel cuffed my wrists. The absurdity was staggering: a career criminal in a fake uniform arresting a retired FBI agent in his own home, all on camera. You have the right to remain silent, Daniel recited, clearly parroting TV cop shows. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The irony was delicious. Everything they said was being recorded, and it would be used against them, just not how they imagined. As Daniel finished his Miranda spiel, I heard the sound I'd been waiting for, the low rumble of multiple vehicles pulling up outside, the unmistakable approach of real law enforcement. Vincent's face paled. Daniel froze, confusion clouding his eyes. Sarah's clipboard slipped, her hands trembling. Mr. Thompson, what's going on? Who did you call? Vincent demanded, his voice cracking. Before I could answer, a loud knock echoed, followed by a voice that carried genuine authority. This is Scottsdale PD. Everyone, come outside now, hands visible. Sergeant Elena Vargas, a 15-year veteran, stood at my door with backup officers, their badges real, their presence commanding. The contrast was stark. Daniel, still clinging to his role, tried to assert control. Officers, I'm Community Standards Enforcement Officer Brooks, conducting an official arrest. You need to coordinate with my supervisor. He flashed his plastic badge, apparently believing it would sway real police. Sergeant Vargas's expression was a mix of disbelief and suppressed laughter. Sir, you're under arrest for impersonating a police officer, assault, unlawful imprisonment, and fraud, she said, her voice cutting like steel. She cuffed Daniel with the efficiency of someone who'd ended countless criminal careers. Vincent tried to distance himself, claiming he was a misled consultant, but it was too late. Sarah, now visibly panicked, clutched her clipboard like a shield. As Vargas's team secured the trio, Mike Delgado arrived, his eyes widening at the scene. Jack, you've outdone yourself, he said, glancing at the fake van parked outside. Within hours, Desert Bloom Estates was a hive of activity. Federal agents from the FBI's Phoenix field office swarmed the scene, joined by state investigators and local police. Daniel's van was a goldmine. Stacks of fake uniforms, fraudulent citations, victim files from multiple communities, and financial records showing over $200,000 in illegal collections over 2 years. My surveillance footage, meticulously time-stamped, provided a roadmap of their crimes. Agent Rachel Patel, leading the FBI's white-collar crime unit, took charge. After verifying my background, she was blunt. Mr. Thompson, this is some of the best civilian documentation I've seen. Would you consult on this case? We need your expertise to map out Russo's operation. I agreed without hesitation. My FBI days had taught me how to dismantle criminal networks, and this was personal. The investigation revealed Russo's operation was vast, spanning 6 states with over 30 accomplices posing as fake inspectors, marshals, and enforcers. They'd stolen over $2 million, targeting elderly residents who were too scared or embarrassed to report the crimes. The most disturbing find came from Russo's Phoenix office. Behind a legitimate-looking business front, agents uncovered files on hundreds of victims' social security numbers, financial records, and personal details obtained through identity theft. Russo wasn't just running scams. He was operating an identity theft ring, selecting victims based on their wealth and vulnerability. Mrs. Garcia, Mr. Lee, and others weren't random, they were chosen for their inability to fight back. I spent the next days helping Agent Patel coordinate victim outreach. The stories were heartbreaking. Mrs. Garcia had paid $2,000 total, draining her savings. Mr. Lee had listed his home for sale, terrified of fake legal threats. A veteran, Frank Sullivan, had paid $4,000 and was considering a second mortgage to cover more fines. The psychological toll was worse. Residents developed anxiety, depression, and paranoia, afraid to trust anyone claiming authority. As the investigation expanded, I realized my quiet retirement was over. Russo's network was a national problem, and I had the skills to fight it. But first, we needed to bring justice to Desert Bloom Estates. The aftermath of the arrests transformed Desert Bloom Estates into a hub of law enforcement activity, a stark contrast to the quiet retirement community I'd chosen 4 years ago. At 58, I'd thought my days of chasing criminals were behind me, but Vincent Russo, Daniel Brooks, and Sarah Mitchell had brought the fight to my doorstep. Now, with their fake police van impounded and my surveillance footage in the hands of the FBI, I was back in the game not as an agent, but as a consultant determined to see justice served. Agent Rachel Patel's team worked tirelessly, piecing together the scope of Russo's operation. My townhouse became a temporary command center, with agents reviewing my recordings and cross-referencing them with evidence from the van. The files found there were chilling, detailed dossiers on residents across Arizona, Nevada, and beyond, listing everything from bank balances to medical conditions. Russo's network had exploited this data to target the elderly, leveraging their trust in authority and fear of legal trouble to extract millions. I focused on victim outreach, using my FBI experience to build trust with neighbors who'd been terrorized. Mrs. Maria Garcia, a 72-year-old widow, broke down as she recounted paying $2,000 in fake fines, convinced she'd lose her home otherwise. They said I'd be evicted if I didn't comply, she whispered, her hands trembling. Mr. David Lee, a retired engineer, admitted he'd been ready to flee Scottsdale, haunted by threats of legal action that never existed. Frank Sullivan, a 68-year-old Vietnam veteran, had paid $4,000 and was on the verge of financial ruin, his pride keeping him silent until I approached. The emotional toll was devastating. These were people who'd worked hard, saved diligently, and settled in Desert Bloom for peace, only to be preyed upon by criminals in costumes. Many developed anxiety, refusing to answer their doors or trust official correspondence. Helping them share their stories wasn't just about building a case, it was about restoring their dignity. Meanwhile, the investigation uncovered Russo's playbook. His network operated like a franchise, with local operatives like Daniel and Sarah trained to impersonate officials using forged documents and scripted intimidation. They targeted communities with minimal HOA oversight, where residents valued privacy and rarely verified claims. The financial haul was staggering $2.3 million across 6 states, funneled through shell companies Russo controlled. His Phoenix office, disguised as a consulting firm, was the nerve center, complete with a call center to follow up on fines and pressure victims. Agent Patel asked me to join a federal task force forming to combat what was now clear, a national epidemic of fake authority fraud. We're seeing these schemes in 20 states, she said. Local police lack the resources to tackle them, and we need someone like you to develop training and victim support programs. The offer was tempting, a chance to use my skills without the grind of active duty. I promised to consider it, but first, I wanted Russo and his crew behind bars. The legal process moved swiftly, thanks to the mountain of evidence. My surveillance footage showing Daniel's assault, Sarah's documentation, and Russo's threats was airtight. The van's contents, including victim files and financial records, tied the trio to dozens of crimes. Federal prosecutors built a RICO case, charging Russo with racketeering, fraud, identity theft, and weapons violations for attempting to seize my firearms. Daniel faced additional charges for assaulting a federal agent and unlawful imprisonment, while Sarah's role as an accomplice brought fraud and harassment counts. I testified at the preliminary hearings, recounting every detail of their visits. Standing in the courtroom, I saw Russo's polished facade crack as prosecutors played my recordings. Daniel, still clinging to his cop fantasy, looked deflated in his orange jumpsuit. Sarah's eyes darted nervously, her clipboard bravado gone. The victims' testimonies were the hardest to hear. Mrs. Garcia's quiet sobs, Frank Sullivan's clenched jaw as he described his shame. Their courage strengthened my resolve. As the trial loomed, Russo's team tried to negotiate. He offered a plea deal, hoping to avoid a life sentence. Prosecutors, armed with overwhelming evidence, held firm. Daniel and Sarah, facing years in prison, turned on Russo, providing details of his operation in exchange for leniency. The betrayal didn't surprise me. Criminals like Russo thrive on loyalty until it's inconvenient. Outside the courtroom, Desert Bloom Estates began to heal. I organized a community meeting, inviting victims to share their experiences and learn how to spot scams. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, the retired court clerk who'd been my ally, took the lead, proposing a new HOA with elected leaders and transparent processes. "We trusted too much," she said, her voice firm. "Never again." Residents agreed, forming a safety committee to monitor suspicious activity and educate neighbors. I also worked with Agent Patel to return stolen funds. Federal forfeiture proceedings seized Russo's assets, bank accounts, properties, even his sleek sedan totaling $2.1 million. Mrs. Garcia received enough to cover her medical bills, her relief palpable. Frank Sullivan used his share for a long-overdue vacation with his grandkids, his first trip in years. Mr. Lee, no longer planning to move, installed security cameras, and his confidence slowly returned. Seeing my neighbors reclaim their lives was more rewarding than any case I'd closed as an agent. But the fight wasn't over. Russo's network had roots in other states, and copycat schemes were emerging. Agent Patel's task force offered loomed larger, promising a chance to protect communities nationwide. I was torn. Retirement had been my escape, but the thought of predators like Russo targeting others kept me awake at night. My old FBI mantra echoed, "You don't rest when bad people wear uniforms and knock on doors." As the trial date approached, I prepared for the showdown. Russo's plea negotiations collapsed, and prosecutors pushed for a public trial to expose his operation's scope. I was ready to testify again, to face him in court and ensure he paid for every dollar stolen, every trust broken. Desert Bloom Estates was no longer just my home. It was a symbol of resilience, and I'd fight to keep it that way. The federal courtroom in Phoenix was packed, the air thick with anticipation. At 58, I'd seen my share of trials, but this one felt different. Vincent Russo, Daniel Brooks, and Sarah Mitchell sat at the defense table, their fake authority stripped away, replaced by the stark reality of justice. My neighbors from Desert Bloom Estates filled the gallery. Mrs. Maria Garcia, clutching her rosary, Frank Sullivan sitting ramrod straight, Mrs. Evelyn Carter with her notebook, still documenting every detail. This wasn't just about punishing criminals. It was about restoring trust to a community that had been violated. As I took the stand, I knew this was the final chapter of a battle I'd never expected to fight in retirement. The trial was a spectacle, covered by local news and even picked up by national outlets. Prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence. My surveillance footage capturing Russo's threats, Daniel's assault, and Sarah's meticulous fraud, the fake van's contents, including victim files and forged documents, financial records tracing $2.3 million in stolen funds. My testimony laid out the timeline: how Sarah's grudge had escalated into a criminal conspiracy, how Russo's network exploited vulnerable residents, and how their attempt to seize my firearms crossed into federal territory. I spoke calmly, letting the facts do the heavy lifting, but inside, I burned with the same protective rage that had driven me as an FBI agent. The victims' testimonies were the heart of the case. Mrs. Garcia's voice trembled as she described her fear of losing her home, her savings drained by fake fines. Frank Sullivan, his pride wounded, admitted he'd felt helpless, a feeling no veteran should endure. Mr. David Lee spoke of his sleepless nights, convinced he'd face jail for non-existent violations. Their stories weren't just evidence, they were a rallying cry, exposing the human cost of Russo's greed. Russo's defense was a desperate scramble. His lawyer painted him as a misguided entrepreneur, claiming he'd been duped by Daniel and Sarah. But the paper trail shell companies, encrypted emails, victim dossiers tied him directly to the operation. Daniel, still delusional, tried to justify his actions as community service, earning a sharp rebuke from the judge. Sarah, the weakest link, broke down, admitting she'd been drawn in by Russo's promises of power, but insisting she'd never meant harm. Her tears didn't sway the jury. The evidence was too damning. After 3 weeks, the verdict came swiftly. Vincent Russo was convicted on all counts: racketeering, fraud, identity theft, and weapons violations. The judge sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release, and ordered $2.1 million in restitution to victims. His assets, bank accounts, properties, even his tailored suits were seized to fund the payouts. Daniel Brooks, guilty of assault, unlawful imprisonment, and fraud, received 8 years, with a permanent ban from security or law enforcement work. Sarah Mitchell, convicted as an accomplice, got 4 years of probation, 1,000 hours of community service, mandatory counseling, and $23,000 in restitution to Desert Bloom residents. The courtroom erupted in quiet relief. Mrs. Garcia hugged me, tears streaming down her face. Frank Sullivan shook my hand, his grip firm, his eyes clear for the first time in months. Mrs. Carter, ever the clerk, noted the sentences in her notebook, a satisfied smile on her lips. The victory wasn't just legal, it was personal, a reclaiming of our community's safety. Post-trial, I worked with Agent Rachel Patel to distribute the restitution. Mrs. Garcia paid off her medical bills, her smile brighter than I'd ever seen. Frank Sullivan took his grandkids to the Grand Canyon, his first vacation in years. Mr. Lee upgraded his home security, choosing to stay in Desert Bloom rather than flee. The money mattered, but the real healing came from seeing my neighbors regain their confidence, no longer afraid of every knock at the door. The case's impact rippled far beyond Scottsdale. The Department of Justice used our evidence to launch a national initiative against fake authority fraud. I accepted Agent Patel's offer to join the task force as a senior consultant, designing training programs for local police and educational materials for communities. The role let me use my FBI skills while keeping the flexibility of retirement, traveling to vulnerable neighborhoods, training officers to spot scams, and helping prosecutors build cases against organized crime. It was the perfect balance, turning my experience as both victim and investigator into a shield for others. Desert Bloom Estates emerged stronger than ever. Mrs. Carter led the new HOA, implementing transparent processes and a neighborhood watch that deterred fraud without sacrificing privacy. We installed security cameras in common areas, shared alerts via a community app, and held regular meetings to educate residents on scam prevention. What had been a target for criminals became a model for resilience, with Mrs. Carter advising other Arizona communities on similar programs. Sitting on my patio one evening, sipping coffee in the same wooden chair Sarah once photographed, I reflected on the journey. 4 years ago, I'd moved here for peace, thinking my FBI days were done. Russo and his crew had shattered that illusion, but they'd also reminded me why I'd joined the Bureau in the first place: to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Their fake power had threatened my neighbors. My real authority, built on experience, evidence, and resolve, had ended their game. The national initiative gained traction, with our training materials adopted by police departments across 20 states. I traveled to places like Reno and Albuquerque, meeting residents who'd faced similar scams, their stories echoing Desert Bloom's. Each case reinforced the same truth: predators thrive on trust, but communities united in vigilance can stop them. My work wasn't just a job, it was a mission, ensuring no one else felt the fear Mrs. Garcia or Frank Sullivan had endured. As I looked out at the quiet streets of Desert Bloom, now lit by solar-powered lamps we'd funded through HOA dues, I felt a deep satisfaction. Retirement hadn't been what I'd expected, but it was better. I'd found purpose, not in solitude, but in standing up for my neighbors, turning a personal attack into a nationwide fight against injustice. The bad guys had knocked on the wrong door, and we'd answered with the full force of the law. Thank you for following Jack Thompson's story, a tale of deception, resilience, and justice in the heart of Desert Bloom Estates. This case raises tough questions about trust, authority, and the fight against those who exploit the vulnerable. Have you or someone you know faced a similar injustice, where fake authority or bullying disrupted your life? How do you balance respect for rules with the need to question suspicious demands? And what role should communities play in confronting predators who hide behind uniforms or titles? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Take a stand, express your perspective, and let's spark a conversation about standing up to violence and injustice in our lives. Your voice matters. Join the discussion and help others learn from your experiences.